All right. Okay, I think that's my cue. So welcome everybody to our workshop on called Radical Collaborations for Land Access. I am Fran Miller, and I am a senior staff attorney and adjunct faculty at Vermont Law School. And I'm here with Johanna Rosen, who is currently at Agrarian Trust. Our third presenter, Shona Sanford Long, unfortunately is sick, but hopefully will join us in the audience anyway and can help answer questions. I just wanted to set an intention for this workshop, which is that Joe and I are really interested in having conversation. We are not experts by any means. We all feel that you all have as much expertise in any of this as we do. And we're really eager to make this a learning opportunity for all of us. So just to start, you all know as well as we do, there's so many reasons that our country needs to be doing more to support smallholder farmers who are farming regeneratively, using ecological practices, growing food and raising animals to feed our communities at an affordable price. And this is a public good, and it should be treated as such, but it's not. And while we advocate for this on a policy level, if everybody could mute, thank you, that would be great. While we're advocating for this on a policy level, some of us are addressing some of the difficulties that these farmers are facing by working to build off community land trust models that have been created to hold agricultural land in a commons to be managed by local community, whatever that community might be. And we're going to talk about a couple of examples of that. But again, mostly we want this workshop to be participatory, and we want to hear from you all what your questions are, what you're doing to address these barriers. So one thing that we would love is if you would put in the chat, and I think that we're using the chat on the Zoom, put in the chat who you are, introduce yourself, what land are you on, what maybe just something about this topic that touches you, interests you, why you're here. That would be helpful to us to help us talk. Okay. And maybe I'll take a second if y'all could put some stuff in the chat. I could read it out loud or.
And can I just add, if you can tell us if you're a farmer or service provider or what your role is with food and agriculture, that would be helpful too. Thanks.
The chat is on the bottom in the middle of the Zoom. If you're on Whova and that's hard to do, there's a chat on Whova at the top. So I see Hawa Varney from Liberia. She works with women smallholder farmers. Welcome. So I'll just keep going. There's Francesca Gallo. Great. I'm going to keep moving, but please take a look at all of these wonderful people who are part of this. So just setting the road here, I'm going to introduce where I'm from, the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems, and a little bit of the work that I do on farmland access. We're going to hear from Joe on the Agrarian Trust model, and then we're going to have some discussion. So real briefly, the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems, we train law and policy students in food and agriculture policy, and we teach classes in the field. We also provide experience to students by partnering with organizations to develop free legal resources for policymakers and farmers and consumers and other stakeholders in the food system. And our students can get legal and master's degrees in food and ag policy. And then just to give a quick sense of the breadth of what we work on, we created the Farmland Access Legal Toolkit to help farmers and landowners affordably access, transfer, and conserve farmland. It includes a web-based farm lease builder, which you can find on that site, that help make the process much easier to build a lease, which you then have to bring to a lawyer. Through the Extension Legal Services Initiative, we've created resources for food producers that answer legal questions, predominantly about the Food Safety Modernization Act. And then the Farmers Market Legal Toolkit contains best practice recommendations, risk management tools, and case studies. Doris, signal to me if I am speaking too fast. Okay. Okay, so now to the subject at hand. We're focusing obviously on land access, and in particular, ways to make land more accessible to limited resource farmers by using collaborative models. And I've been working on this issue for the last couple of years as part of my work to expand this toolkit. And you can find this at farmlandaccess.org. We have a section in the toolkit on collaborative farming, which talks about the various ways that people can informally and formally farm collaboratively. And it includes the legal issues that come up. Today, that we're really focusing on ownership models that involve collaboration, or more than one farmer or family owning the land that's being farmed. So first, we're going to talk about the Agrarian Trust and its launch and development of Agrarian Commons across the country. On the Farmland Access site, we have added a guide to creating an Agrarian Commons, which includes the legal documents that support these commons. And these documents were created by a collective of lawyers, farmers, and other practitioners, and really can be used for anyone, by anyone who's looking to create a community-based model. Somebody's not muted. Please mute. Thank you. So I'm going to turn this presentation over to Jo Rosen, who, as I said, recently joined Agrarian Trust. Jo is a farmer, seed farmer, and she's someone who has a lot of experience in trying to create equitable models of land access for farmers. So without further ado, Jo.
Thank you, Fran. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here today in conversation with you about this. As Fran said, I'm Johanna Rosen, or Jo. I use she, her pronouns. I live on and steward Pecumtuck land in western Massachusetts. And I recently joined Agrarian Trust, very new to the organization, as Commons Alliance facilitator. My background is in urban agriculture, local and regional food system networks, and I've spent the past 8 years or so working with farmers and land trusts to protect affordability of farmland, including through shared ownership arrangements. And Agrarian Trust is a national nonprofit with a mission to support land access for the next generation of farmers. Next slide, please. So as, oh, I'm getting an echo. If someone isn't muted, if you can mute, please. Thank you. Thank you to everyone for introducing yourselves. I was trying to follow along. It's helpful to see. It looks like there's a good mix of farmers and educators and service providers. So I'm sure many of you know from different perspectives, but I wanted to set some context for why this work and this conversation is important to us. We see that people have lost connection to the earth and to each other and to their food. And with the aging farmer population that we have in this country, it's projected that over 400 million acres of land will change hands in the next 10 years. So that presents a huge opportunity for us to pursue land-based justice and community control of land. The current situation with farmland ownership is that it's extremely consolidated, owned by non-farming landowners and large farms holding disproportionate amounts of land. And there's added pressure from investors, corporations, and developers. There's also a stark racial imbalance. 98% of farmland is owned by white people. And we need to imagine new possibilities to ensure that everyone has access to land to grow food to support thriving communities. There's a problem with land values going up, in some places rising over 400% in 15 years. This makes land ownership unattainable for most people, with the value being based on potential extraction or development rather than on what farmers can afford to pay based on agricultural production. So often farmers, if they can afford land, are burdened heavily by debt and then feel the need to push the land to produce at a level that allows their farm business to be viable, which may not be sustainable and allow the land itself to regenerate. Next slide, please. So this is a map many of you may have seen before, just showing where the heaviest development pressure is. Most farmland conservation work is aimed at protecting open space, which is great. It's really important. We need to continue to do that, but it often doesn't go far enough to protect affordability of the land and to protect regenerative practices and community control over that land. So Agrarian Trust really sees this as a national crisis that requires local solutions. Next slide, please. The way we view land ownership in this country is very often based on private property and individual ownership and legal structures that are really a legacy of colonialism. And this quote represents what I've heard expressed often as an indigenous worldview, the interdependence between human and non-human relatives, including land and water. And what Agrarian Trust aims to do is to decommodify land. Next slide, please. I apologize. I know some of these graphics that I have here are going to be hard to read in the slides, but they are all available on our website, agrariantrust.org. And I can drop that link in the chat when I'm not talking. Or maybe Fran will do it for me. Thank you. So Agrarian Trust created Agrarian Commons, as Fran was describing with the legal toolkit, to own the land and provide long-term secure access to the land for farmers who can then build equity from the land, with the focus on shifting the paradigm from private individual property ownership towards shared land stewardship and community ownership. So before, we had conservation land trusts. There are over 1,300 in the US, and they've been around for over 100 years. They often are eligible for federal and sometimes state funding for conservation. And some of them work with working lands, farmland, forest land, ranch land, but many are focused just on preventing development, protecting open space, sometimes recreation or view sheds. Their work isn't always focused on farmers' needs, although there are some out there doing great work. I don't mean to disparage conservation land trusts at all. Community land trusts have only been around 50 years, and there are less than 300 of them. And they're not always eligible for the same kinds of funding sources. The first was New Communities, which was started by civil rights activists in Georgia in the 60s. And that project was agricultural based. They did research on the Israeli kibbutz model, on the Boudin land reform movement in India. But since then, most community land trusts have really been focused in urban areas and on affordable housing, and not as much on farmland, although some community land trusts do hold farmland, either as part of their holdings or as their main focus. But Agrarian Trust really created the Agrarian Commons to serve this need of protecting working farmland and ensuring community control over it. So the way it's structured is that Agrarian Trust is the national nonprofit land trust as the umbrella, with local Agrarian Commons acting like farmland CLTs in different localities. And they launched last year, so this is still very new even to Agrarian Trust. These are still in development. And as Fran shared, the model was developed through 2 years of work with committees, including attorneys that helped put all those documents together that are in that toolkit. Next slide, please. In this model, the land is held locally in these 501c2 organizations. It's a type of limited scope nonprofit that is really just to hold land and convey leases to that land. They don't have other programming activities or fundraising. The board is comprised of the farmer leaseholders, community members, and Agrarian Trust representatives. And each local group, each Agrarian Commons, determines its board based on its own needs. The Commons will convey long-term, usually 99-year leases to farmers or land-based groups. And it varies a little bit by state what the longest allowable is, but the goal is to have it be lifetime tenure and in some cases inheritable. The lease fees will be set at affordable rates, paid to the Agrarian Commons, and then used to reinvest in the farm and different equity arrangements, or investing in infrastructure. And those details will be continued to be worked out as the leases are written for each commons and for each farmer lessee. Typically, the buildings and the infrastructure would belong to the lessee, to the farmer, and that would then be an asset that they could sell at the end of the lease. So in that way, they have financial equity in the property without actually owning the farm land. The bylaws for the local commons will restrict land from being encumbered by debt and restrict its sale on the open market. So that's part of what helps to keep it affordable over time and not have the speculative value continue to rise and rise. Agrarian Trust uses gifts of land, bargain sales, which is when farms are sold below market value, and charitable fundraising to acquire and invest in these farm properties. And mostly we're relying on philanthropic money because the farmland investment models don't always completely decommodify the land. Next slide. So this is a little technical diagram to show how the 501c2 works. Again, its role is limited to managing the land and leases, and the farmers are represented on the board, so they're part of the decision-making structure. The Agrarian Commons is intended to have a low administrative burden and to be flexible, to be able to respond to the needs of the particular community that it's serving, and to focus on the relationships among people and the land and their community. Next slide. So the Agrarian Commons long-term lease tenure, as I mentioned, the goal is to really provide security, since a lot of farmers relying on renting land don't have long-term security and can't invest in soil building, infrastructure development, those sorts of things, even relationships that support their business if they don't know if they're going to be there in 3 or 5 years. The Agrarian Commons want to work with farmers who are interested in making investments in soil health and using regenerative practices that support climate resilience. We want to work with farm businesses that are serving varied markets, so could be local or regional, direct or wholesale, different kinds of products. We want to see connections to communities, engaging schools, organizations, other aligned farms, and building that connection through events, different kinds of gatherings, festivals, educational programs. We value honoring knowledge and culture and support sharing between generations, including opportunities for different ways of layering enterprises and partnerships for employment and learning opportunities, especially as we're looking at the succession issues with farmers retiring. We want to move from extractive relationships to restore connections, particularly for those whose land was stolen, for those who've been displaced from their homelands and excluded from access to the land. Next slide. So this map shows where the 12 Agrarian Commons that launched last year are located. They were selected based on need. Some are statewide and some are regional. That's what the different size circles is meant to depict. It's not a very precise map, but it gives you an idea of where they are. And they're all at different stages. Some have land and are looking for farmers. Some have farmers and are looking for land. And the details of each commons can be found on our website. The goal is that each commons eventually own 4 to 12 properties to really build community. So some of them are starting with 1. The one in New Hampshire I'll talk about has 3 kind of in queue. So they're meant to serve as examples of different ways to approach this. We're exploring more, we're getting a lot of interest all the time, and we're hoping that others will continue to adapt this model. Again, this isn't the solution, and it needs to continue to evolve. Next slide. So I'm still getting familiar with all 12 existing commons, but I wanted to share a couple of specific examples. The Little Juba, Central Maine Agrarian Commons is one of the furthest along. I've been working on helping to develop the long-term lease for this project. The lessee in this case is going to be the Somali Bantu Community Association, which is a nonprofit that has over 200 farming families as part of its membership. And in addition to farming the land, they will be doing land-based cultural activities. Agrarian Trust was able to purchase a farm on behalf of this project, a 104-acre farm in Wales, Maine. And in addition to the individual families that are part of the Somali Bantu Community Association, the nonprofit itself has a farm operation called Liberation Farms that will be producing food on this land and is really leading the infrastructure development. Next slide, please. So again, this is just a diagram to give you a sense of how the commons is structured, with the Agrarian Trust being the sort of umbrella for the local commons, and the local commons then providing a lease to the Somali Bantu Community Association for Liberation Farms, and the community also having representation on the board. Next slide. This is a map of the farm. There was existing infrastructure there, a house and barns and sheds that will be used by the Somali Bantu Community Association for their operations as office space. There will be a prayer room, and they're building the additional infrastructure that they need for the farm operation. So they've added hoop houses. They're in the process of building a halal slaughter facility, and they will own all that infrastructure. So this example is a little bit different from others because it's a nonprofit lessee rather than an individual farmer farm business. But again, this is to show how the model can be adapted to different circumstances. Next slide, please. So another example I wanted to share is the New Hampshire Agrarian Commons. Unlike the Maine example, this one is statewide, and it's being founded with 3 farms, and all 3 of them had previously been conserved with conservation easements. So they were already protected from development, but the owners of the farm businesses wanted to go beyond that. They were finding that their organic regenerative practices weren't necessarily protected by the easements, and that they were still unable to invest in their farm businesses the way they wanted to because of the debt burden on the land. Next slide, please. So this map from American Farmland Trust shows the red in that southeast corner of the state is the high development pressure closer to Boston. And all 3 farms that we're working with are in that region. They are all kind of mid-career, mid-size farms, and wanted to stay on the land, but didn't feel that they needed to continue to own it. So 2 of the farms are currently owned by the farm family, the farm business, And the third one had been actually owned by the Monadnock Community Land Trust, which is primarily focused on housing, and was able to donate that land to the Agrarian Commons in this case. And the other two, Agrarian Trust is fundraising to be able to purchase those properties. Just trying to make sure I didn't miss anything on these. I think that's it. Next slide, please. So that's all I have on that. Thanks for listening. I'm sorry that looks like you can't read my email address very well. Johanna@agrariantrust.org. I can also put it in the chat. Feel free to contact me, and both of the Agrarian Commons that I highlighted actually have active fundraisers on our website. So if you want to check those out, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Joe. That was a really helpful. I think I understand the AT better than I did before. I think that was really helpful. So I'm gonna move us into speaking about a local project here in Tunbridge, Vermont, and then we will open it up for questions and comments and conversation. This project is called the White River Land Collaborative, and it's, for now, focused on one farm. And it's in its infancy, so it isn't as developed as the Agrarian Commons, but it is, maybe because I'm involved in it, it is very informed by some of the work that the Agrarian Trust did to launch the Agrarian Commons, which I was involved in. So this project, we describe ourselves as farmer-led and community-driven, where we have a project team that is led by a couple of local farmers, a mom and daughter, along with a few community members, including myself. So I have a couple of hats. I'm here as both Center for Ag and Food Systems lawyer, and also I'm a local community member. And this project grew out of a community development process that focused on teasing out our local community's needs. So this is just a probably hard to read map of the land. I'm just going to talk about it a little bit. So this was a former organic dairy farm. There's 200 acres here. Because it was dairy, there's a lot of infrastructure. And just to broaden for a second, the state of Vermont and other states are really grappling with what to do with dairy farms that are being transitioned, because they do tend to be larger. Even in our small states, there's a lot of acreage for us, and smallholder farmers who can afford to buy 200 acres, for example. So really, multiple agricultural uses on the property would be the best thing. But then how do you do that when our current models are usually just one family farm owning the property? And that's really some of the genesis of this project. So this land, there's 45 acres in permanent pasture. There's some river frontage. There's a conservation easement on 60 acres. There's several different barns. And then there's also a large house. So just to back up a second, Shona Sanford Long, who owns Flying Dog Farm, maybe she's on the call, I hope, and getting better. She is the daughter of Suzanne Long, who is a longtime organic farmer here in Vermont. And she purchased the livestock business from her parents and was looking to, she needs land. She's got cows and pigs and sheep, she needs land. And so she went to see this farm that went up for sale, but they were asking a whole lot of money, which they had invested in the farm. So they needed that cash. And there was no way she could afford it. And so she came to me, and I involved some other people, and we created a project team to see if we could put together a community-based effort to purchase this farm and create a commons type of ownership model here for this property. And Vermont Land Trust owned the conservation easement on the farm and ended up purchasing the property and giving us, the White River Land Collaborative, a 5-year lease with an option to purchase the land. When we started negotiating with the original farm owners and with Vermont Land Trust in February of this year, we had no organization. We had literally just created the project team and started to form an advisory board. So we went to a local nonprofit, the Alliance for Vermont Communities, and we asked them to fiscally sponsor us so we could accept charitable donations towards the purchase of the land. AVC agreed to that, and that also allowed us to enter into this lease agreement with Vermont Land Trust. And we are now leasing from VLT. We are subleasing to Flying Dog Farm for the farm, for pasture land, and for some barn use. And we are also subleasing the house to local farm workers in the area. In terms of winter projects, so literally, as I said, we just started leasing in June, but the various things that we are planning now to do include determining our governance structure. We are leaning towards the Agrarian Commons type model of having a 501c2 local land holding entity that would just do the minimum of holding title to the land, but also include a board that included all of the lessees on the land, representatives from all the agricultural enterprises, and some local community stakeholders. We're also planning to do a further community engagement process to see what else the community thinks we might need and how this project could serve those needs. We're doing an assessment on the barn and the other infrastructure to see what kind of renovations we would need to do or could do that would allow for other uses. And then we're also recruiting BIPOC advisory board members to help us. We are a white-led project, but we have racial equity as a core value of ours, and we need help to develop our process for soliciting and selecting additional farmer tenant collaborators. And then we're fundraising to purchase the land from Vermont Land Trust. And these are just a couple of pictures of the property. This is a barn that was built in 1914. I am from New York City and do not know a lot about barns, but everybody who sees it is kind of blown away by it's beautiful and it's in fairly decent shape. To the right is just a view from a sugar house that was built some time ago. The property is 60 acres of pasture and 140 acres of forest. And then there's some river frontage, as I said. So if Shona were speaking, she would talk as the farmer on the land. She's now on the land. And some of the challenges that she has talked about, and we can talk more about this in the conversation that we have, because I know there's a whole lot of farmers on this call, and you can speak to this more than I can read Shona's challenges, but land access, working alone, access to equipment and startup costs. Shona is a livestock farmer and she doesn't have a tractor, and now she's on land. And so she's trying to farm regeneratively, and there's all of these costs that are upfront you know, you all know this better than I, all these needs that new farmers have, that it's very difficult to find capital. How do you make a living and produce affordable food for your community while you're stewarding the land in this regenerative way? And as I said, the upfront capital investments. And then what the project provides is the ability to collaborate, the ability to share equipment. She won't, and others won't have the debt burden associated with buying land. Perhaps she can build equity in different ways and raise a family, and we're very eager to involve the community in this. So these are the things that we're doing. And, you know, in some ways they mirror what Joe was talking about Agrarian Trust wanting to do. So we hope to reduce barriers to land access for underserved farmers. We are supporting ecological stewardship of ag and forest lands. We are on unceded Abenaki territory here, and we are giving land access and management to local Abenaki land stewards and hope to really involve more people in that. We're integrating solar and other energy technologies. So part of this project, on the 140 acres of forested land, the prior farmer had cleared 30 acres on a pretty steep slope that is not great soil. And we had been talking from the beginning to a local solar company, which is going to put an array up on that section of the land. And that will also give us 25 years of lease payments of $15,000 a year, which helps us be self-sustaining. We are taking agricultural land off the speculative real estate market, which is so important in this moment when land prices are going up astronomically. And we hope to inspire more models here in Vermont and beyond for this kind of ownership / stewardship of land. So key to our success with this project is that the local community has been very supportive of these efforts, and we will continue to organize that support. Just before I wrap up on the legal side, the legal structure, as I mentioned, one of our winter projects is exploring the possibilities for legal structures. We do hope to do this as a community land trust in the way that Joe described, and we're hopeful that our fiscal sponsor may agree to be the parent organization to a newly created land trust that holds the land and manages the agricultural operations, while the nonprofit does all the educational activities and that sort of thing. So that's our hope. And this is how you can contact me, fmiller@vermontlaw.edu. Let me start sharing my screen here. Okay. So Agrarian Commons and White River Land Collaborative are just two examples of the collaborations on land access and farming that are happening across the country. And we're really hoping to have some conversation here about these, whether it's about the models that we've presented or about what you all are doing. So I want to open it up now for questions, comments. Tell us what you're doing. Just say hello. If you want to come out on the screen, that'd be great. But if you don't, that's fine too. You can just unmute, or you can put questions in the chat or comments, whatever you want to do. But we hope to hear from you. So I'm going to open it up.
Good morning. Thank you all so much for your information, or afternoon now, I guess. I was wondering, how is it possible for urban land situations to be a part of the Agrarian Trust, or look more into that if the hope is to gain urban land, or would that be a better route within the community land trust? Kind of worried about how y'all work with different urban agriculture opportunities.
Thank you for that question. It's a great question and near and dear to my heart with my background farming for over 10 years in Philadelphia. So yes, this model can be used for urban land. The focus of the existing commons is primarily on rural land and farms that can produce at a certain scale to feed their communities. But different cities are different, and some cities have a lot of land available that could produce food. And some of the commons are in more urban areas. So the Confluence Agrarian Commons is in the Mid-Atlantic, and I believe it's the Central Virginia Agrarian Commons is also looking for more urban land. And certainly this model, whether or not it's part of Agrarian Trust, could serve urban land, whether it's through an existing community land trust that is willing to hold either community gardens or urban farms, or a new organization that's set up specifically for that. But the nice thing about this model is that it's flexible and that it should be able to serve urban communities as well as rural.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Kai. I would just add so Joe talked about there's conservation land trusts and there's community land trusts, and then there's community land trusts that hold ag lands. Some of the community land trusts, 300 or so around the country, they're more urban, and they do include ag lands, whether it's community gardens or urban farms. There's one, I think the one in Boston, Dudley Street, I think that one includes some community gardens, but there's a website that has all the CLTs, which I can find, but that might be another example for you to take a look at. And I think the thing for like the White River Land Collaborative, we're not part of the Agrarian Commons, but we are using all the documents and we're using their model and applying it to our situation. So I think that it's really possible to do in a variety of environments.
Great, thank you.
Other folks? Are other people doing these types of things, or is it all that people want to, or it's just interesting?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Meredith.
Hi, I'm Meredith. I'm in Kansas City, Kansas. I work with New American, mostly refugee or former refugee farmers. And yeah, we just for the first time this year assisted a group of two Congolese folks and a woman from Burundi who share the same language and work pretty collaboratively, assisted them in purchasing like a very, very small urban lot. But we have a 4-year training program, and then the goal is that folks graduate off and continue to grow and sell. But land access is obviously, an issue everywhere. So yeah, they purchased it as an LLC, but it's just been a really interesting experience. And our program has been pushing for a long time, kind of this American, like you and your family, we're going to teach you how to own a business and and do it on your own within your family unit. And we're just, we're realizing that that's not always the best way. And yeah, so just really interested to learn and hear more. We also work with some Somali Bantu folks, and I'm aware of the group in Maine, but hadn't heard, like, I didn't realize that it was associated with the Agrarian Trust. So I'm going to have to reach out to some folks there, and maybe you, Joe, and ask some more questions, and maybe see if we can get those communities connected and they can learn from each other.
That would be great. Please do.
Yeah, I think there's a workshop. I don't know if it was at this time, but there's a Somali Bantu group in the Hudson Valley that I think just got some land. Maybe that's a workshop in this conference. I do see a question. Oh, just one other thing I wanted to mention, Meredith. There's a Lutheran Services Initiative, I think it's called, in Iowa. They're also doing something similar. They work with New Americans, and they're like on the verge of trying to purchase some land in a similar way. I don't know.
Yeah, I think I've met a couple of the folks who work there, and we actually just partnered on a grant with them. So that's one of the conversations we need to have, but thank you.
Great. There's a question here. Fran, it sounds like your group is working on purchasing your land from the land trust that currently has it, and you plan to put it in another land trust. Is that right? Yeah, that is right. The land trust that owns it now is Vermont Land Trust. It's the biggest land trust in the state, and it doesn't own land to hold it. There's a way that land trusts can, what they call buy, protect, sell. So they buy land and then they put a conservation easement on it and then they sell it. This is a little bit different because they're buying it and it was already protected, so they don't have to protect it again, but then they are selling it. They're not going to hold on to it. So we are basically forming our own land trust. And when I use the word land trust, it might not be, it's in a really broad way. I'm really using it just to describe that the entity that will own the land will be pretty limited to holding the land. And then there will be another entity that owns that entity, that's the parent, that will have more of the charitable functions of a nonprofit. I hope that's helpful. And if it's not, ask me more.
I have a question if no one else does. Hi, I'm Lindsay and I work with ACORN, which is the Addison County Relocalization Network in Vermont Champlain Valley, so not too far from where you all are. And our nonprofit works to strengthen the local food and farming community. And I often get questions from landowners who want to invite young farmers onto their land, but they don't necessarily want to transfer ownership. And I'm not sure, I refer to them to the Agrarian Commons, and I just wonder, like, as baby boomers age and they're looking to live out their years on their land, but they want to make sure that their land stays undeveloped and farmland, what are some recommendations that I can give to them that are concrete to help them attract young farmers, but also understanding that young farmers want to have equity in the land and they don't just want to work somebody else's land that they're not going to have in perpetuity. So I was just wondering if you could answer that.
Yeah, I'll start, and Fran, if you want to add anything. Thanks for that question. It's a really tricky situation, and we're lucky here in the Northeast. We have a great resource in Land for Good, and they have a lot of resources on their website about working with agreements between non-farming landowners and farmers. But as you stated in your question, it's really not an ideal situation for the farmers if they don't have long-term security on that land, if they don't have ways to build equity. And so it's hard because the owners may not have a lot of options if their retirement savings, let's say, is in their land. And it depends a lot on the circumstances, but there are ways that, let's say, a retiring farmer or a non-farming landowner, if there happens to be more than one housing unit on the land, that they could stay on the land for their life, and a new farmer could come in and be working that land and keeping it in agriculture without displacing the owner. And that could be structured through a commons type arrangement where there are multiple leases. It could be structured with a life estate. So I don't want to get too sort of wonky in the weeds with it, but there are ways to do it that can serve both parties' needs. But it's a big problem, and it's tricky to navigate, and it's so important to have a good relationship, that the farmer feels like their interests are protected, and not having an owner kind of looking over their shoulder all the time. And especially if they are, for example, really attached to the view shed, they might not like it if, say, a livestock farmer has fencing, or if something was hayed and then it's going to be tilled to put in cover crop or vegetable production or something like that. So there are a lot of issues with how to share land, and the Land for Good resources, I think, can be really helpful for that.
Yeah, I would just add that this issue is coming up a lot in Vermont, where there are a lot of second homeowners or wealthy landowners who, want to do good and help young farmers. And so I think it varies people's intentions. There's a lot of possibility depending on what they're willing to do, because there is, as Joe said, they could just issue a lease. But then, yeah, the young farmer, even if it could be a long-term lease, but what happens when those folks die? Who's their land going to? If they're willing to donate or sell their land in a longer term way, there's a way that they could transfer, they could get a life estate on the land, as Joe said, and then they could transfer the land using an LLC. So the farmer could build equity by what they're doing on the land and increase the amount of equity they have in the LLC and ultimately own it. There's a section on our website, on the farmlandaccess.org website, called LLC Based Transfer, which you might want to look at. That could be helpful. And I'm happy to talk offline about that. I see Shona. Maybe she has more to say about this.
I just wanted to, hi everyone. I just wanted to jump in quickly because I think there is really value, even if you're not at the point of, fully developing a long-term lease or that ownership and equity piece. I know as a beginning farmer, and maybe especially as a livestock farmer, even there is a lot of value even in short-term lease options. And that's how I've, was able to start grazing before I was on this land. And I do still have some, short-term leases to graze other properties. The Vermont Land Link is also a resource to connect farmers and landowners, and actually most of the farms on that are farmers that are looking to sell their land. But I think if there's more landowners looking to sell their land, but I think it would be really valuable to have more landowners that are interested in leasing. And of course, the longer the terms of the lease are, the better, and the more opportunities for equity. But I don't think, just because that's not set up yet, it should be a barrier to any lease. So I think that might be a good place to start helping build connections is the land link.
Thank you.
Kathy.
So I noticed, I'm curious, Joanna, about the Agrarian Trust that you showed on your map, which looks like northern Idaho and Montana. And the reason I'm asking about that is most of the things that have been described here, they're wonderful, they're idealistic, they would probably work in the some of the Willamette Valley where I live in Oregon, but the land that I'm concerned about that I have is in Kansas, and people are talking about quarter section chunks. They're not talking about 104 acres that can support 20 people working on it. We're talking about huge things of land. And so I support what people are doing on smaller spaces, but I'm very curious about what you showed on your map in an area that's dry land, I'm sure. So if you have anything to say about it and if other people are interested, but I think I'm sort of out of the norm here.
Thanks, Kathy. It's a great question, and I unfortunately am not very familiar with the details of the Montana Agrarian Commons. What I do know about it is that it has a slightly different structure than the 501c2 that I described. It's using 501c25, which Fran could probably tell you better about than I could. It's just a slight variation. Instead of having one entity in the commons, it has multiple. So it's a partnership with a lot of local organizations, which just brings more buy-in to the project. But I don't know a lot about the land base that they're working with. I think that one, I'm not totally sure, but I think they might still be looking for land. And the issues that you're talking about in terms of the scale and the types of land are really important. And I think we're going to run into that as we're responding to the inquiries coming in and looking to expand and start new agrarian commons in other parts of the country where the agriculture looks different because of water rights and because of scale. So I'm sorry I can't speak to it more now, but I'd be happy to talk more or connect you with the Agrarian Trust staff who are more involved with that particular commons.
Yeah, I just put a link in the chat. Trust Montana is the local organization in Montana that's heading up that effort. And so they might have more, they might know more. I know they'll know more, but I don't know much about the land base either. And yeah, the C25 is just, it's a C2. I mean, it's where there's more than one parent organization to the smaller land holding entity, as Joe said. Other folks?
Have you ever, this is Karen Stark, hi. Have you ever looked into more cooperative land ownership? Or because I know that in Minnesota, I was just looking them up and I'll put the link in here and I don't know much about it, but it's the Hmong American Farmers Association.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it seems like that's more of a co-op. Now, these are all vegetable and flower farmers, I believe. They don't have any livestock. But I can put that link in there. I just don't know if anyone in the group here maybe knows more about them other than me knowing the name and that I believe that they're a cooperative.
I don't think they own the land cooperatively. I think they might farm cooperatively. They might have their business is a co-op, but I believe that they're a nonprofit. HAFA is a nonprofit, and they're the ones who are we're trying to own the lands. They might own it now. We have a case study on them, but this was done 4 or 5 years ago, and they were trying to buy the land from the people that they were leasing it from.
Okay.
But I do believe that it was the nonprofit that was buying it.
Okay, well, I'll put the link in there if anybody else wants to look. So,
Thanks, Karen. It is an interesting question how this sort of community land trust model interacts with cooperatives, because they hold a lot of similar values. And as Fran was drawing the distinction, if the cooperative is with the business or if it's with the land ownership, it's a little bit different. And land can be shared in different ways with a cooperative enterprise with multiple people, or with different enterprises sharing the same property. There's a great guide about cooperative farming by Faith Gilbert. I can find the link in a minute and put it in the chat too, that elaborates on some of those distinctions and different ways to share, if it's just equipment, if it's marketing, if it's cooperating on rotations and things like that. And Fran and I were just starting to dig into an exploration actually about how limited equity cooperatives in terms of ownership might interact with this kind of community land trust model. So more to learn.
Yeah, and Kate just put some YouTube link. The Center for Rural Affairs, which is based in Nebraska and Iowa, just did a series on cooperatives that involve cooperative land ownership. So I plan to look at that. That looks really interesting. Other questions, comments?
There was something before from Hillary. I wasn't sure if we answered that or which board Hillary was asking about.
Yeah, Hillary, you said you worked with LSI, Lutheran Services. Can you say more how the board governance has worked? I'm not sure what you're asking. Oh, microphone doesn't work. Do you see that, Joe? You said she says, we said it was governed by a commons board. How has that worked with feeling like everyone has equal input?
Yes, sorry, I am seeing that. I was just looking for that link I mentioned and didn't come up with it yet.
I'll find it.
I'm not sure, sorry, Hillary, what Commons board you're referring to, but if it's just the Agrarian Commons in general and how the board governance works, it's still very much in development. That each Commons was established with local community members and farmer lessees if they've already been identified, and Agrarian Trust staff. And as the Commons grow to include more properties, as I mentioned, the target is to grow up to 12 farms in each Commons. There will be more farmer representation on the board and more involvement in that governance. But we're still very much in an establishment and growth kind of phase right now. So I don't know if that answered it, but I'm happy to elaborate if you want to say more about what you want to know.
I think there's just to also say something about this, and if anybody else here is doing work on developing cooperative models, this is a question that feels more to me about process than structure. And people are doing this in a whole lot of different ways. And I think it can be very challenging because we're human and we live in such culturally insane, as Rowan White said yesterday on a webinar, times. Yeah. Anyway, that link I put in is the reference that Joe talked about. She also talks about structure in there in a really helpful way, various ways that you can structure cooperative projects.
Thanks for finding that.
On the process and the cooperative, Soulfire Farm has a lot of resources on their website, and they've done an enormous amount of work to develop their cooperative processes and the ways that they make decisions and come to consensus and that sort of thing. So I highly recommend going to their site and taking a look at the materials that they've shared. Anything else? Well, if there's no other questions, I think we can wrap. Joe and I are happy to talk more about this at any time. So reach out. I think Joe is going to be doing work to develop the Commons Alliance. And so if people are working on these kinds of things, I think that there's a network that's being created, which I can't wait to be part of. So Joe,
Yeah.
any further?
I appreciate you mentioning that since I didn't. My role with Agrarian Trust is to help develop this Commons Alliance network. So it's new, it hasn't launched yet. I'm co-holding that role with Thea Maria Carlson, who's out in California. And the idea is to be having these kinds of conversations, to be sharing resources between groups so that these models can keep evolving and adapting to local needs. There's a national land trust alliance network for conservation land trusts, and there's the Grounded Solutions Network for community land trusts. But this type of focused on farmland work and community held land doesn't fit neatly in either network. And so we really want to develop a network for folks to focus on this and share resources and yeah, keep growing this model in different ways.
So thanks everyone. Thank you, Doris, for translating. Very much appreciated. All right, have a great conference. Bye.
Thank you.